very much. It's good to be back here. I enjoyed always tremendously this very positive intellectual atmosphere that the ARPA Institute has been creating, if I'm not mistaken, since 1992. It is absolutely outstanding, dedicated work of its board, of our great friend Ago. And today I'm going to talk on a topic that I talked on this topic in general, but I've never spoken here at ARPA Institute. And the topic that I would never be allowed to express my thoughts in most of the United States universities. The talk is very much related to what should we do in the broadest perspective to fix multiple problems of human society that we are having worldwide, but also focusing on the developments in Armenia. Because what is demonstrable is that the Armenian issues always have been and are today parts of this enormous pattern of world historical dynamics. And specifically, I'm now teaching 6 courses at AUA, the American University of Armenia, which is an absolutely wonderful institution where is gathering the top of the young thinking people, intellectual elites, not necessarily from rich families. Mostly we have people from the emerging middle class students, but also coming from different villages to study at AUA. And nobody is declined getting education because they cannot pay. So AUA's foundation, AUA's supporters are providing a lot of financial support to the students. AUA is affiliated with the University of California. So our degrees and our credits are accepted. And we very often have this kind of transfers of our students. They study for 3 years at AUA, then transfer to Berkeley or to UC San Diego. We had, for some reason, I don't know why they don't go too much to UCLA, but to UC Irvine also, to other such places. What I want to stress, why this was one of the main reasons why I moved to Armenia on a relatively long-term basis, because now nothing is permanent. I don't want to use the word permanent, like we now can see with or watch with a great interest that there is no such thing like permanent emigration from Armenia or immigration or back. It's like whenever our Armenians who see somewhere opportunities, and if they see now in Armenia, they are going back to Armenia. So this is already clearly a clear-cut evidence, not in too large numbers, but my characterization right now that at this moment Armenia is the #1 country in the world from the standpoint of opportunities and #1 country in the world from the standpoint of potential risks. And so what I am going to present in my brief exploration of what I am doing in multiple details in the course on the relationship between history and political science, I will give you here some very superficial insights. I will tell you why superficial. It has its reason. about the current situation in Armenia and how it relates to the broader situation, socio-political situation, in what's going on in the world. So let's start by stressing the fact that we now live in a very different situation than in the 20th century. The modern times, Arnold Toynbee was thinking that the modern times ended somewhere between the First and Second World War. Others thought that it's mostly historians and political scientists that modern times ended somewhere in the 1960s or 1970s. My own opinion is that the modern world died in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet system, the bipolar world, the system created after the Second World War. And there are many countries and peoples in the countries who search how to deal with times after modernity. I don't want to use too much the French term postmodern because it's mostly philosophical and relates to literature and so on, because the French philosophers, they already were saying in 1945 that after Second World War, the modern is dead. So, but we need to figure out what world we are living in. We need to figure out the pathway, or the multiple pathways that we are taking. And in most of the time, those pathways are taken without an adequate understanding, not very much consciously, and especially without adequate scientific analysis. That's the biggest problem that we are now facing in the world, and we are facing in Armenia. So, because I'm going to talk about those issues of pathways, I've chosen the title of for this presentation, Quo Vadis, which is both from the book of John of the Bible and the famous novel by the Polish writer, novelist of Lithuanian origin, Henryk Sienkiewicz, who was awarded in 1905 the Nobel Prize for Literature. The Nobel Prize for Literature was established in 1901. Sienkiewicz was awarded in 1905. And why I have chosen this, Where Are You Going? Quo Vadis, Where Are You Going? Title, because it's also is very relevant to the current situation in Armenia, and also because in surveys, and we had even some surveys in the 1970s, actually Quo Vadis, which was translated into Armenian under the real good title. Actually, the title was not translated, it was taken from the Bible, Hoyertas. And it was ranked among the 10 top books that were written by foreign authors, the 10 top books that had the most reputation among the Armenian readers worldwide. So you can get it on Amazon, you can listen it on LibriVox if you wish, but it's essentially, it's called a novel from the times of Nero, of Emperor Nero. And Sienkiewicz, in a very beautiful style, he addresses there the issue of the difference between this highly moral society of early Christians and the corrupt, opulent society of the Roman Empire in the 1st, 2nd centuries. It's essentially about the rise of Christianity in Rome, and it was one of the mostly used topics in Hollywood. They shot this Quo Vadis, Hoyertas, I guess 5 or 6 times, last time in 2001, But the most famous of those is the cast of 1951 with Peter Ustinov playing the role of Nero, of Emperor Nero. So it was an Oscar-nominated film. And here I'm bringing in the background, I'm giving you the poster of that movie. And here is actually the illustration to the Bible, to the book of John. When Peter, the Apostle Peter, he flees Rome out of the fear that because he teaches Christianity, he might be killed, he suddenly, on the road from Rome, he sees Jesus. And he asked Jesus, Quo vadis? Hoi yertas teri? And Jesus again is carrying the cross, a cross. And this is what Jesus answers. If you desertest my people, I am going to Rome to be crucified a second time. And so Peter turns around, goes back to Rome, spreads Christianity that eventually leads to the victory of Christianity. Obviously he gets crucified because it's a history of martyrdom. But when we are thinking deeper, the way that the book of John essentially was presenting that, it was much deeper than just spread of Christianity. It's about the path that we are choosing in our lives and the leadership, the role of leadership in that path. And when we are talking about leadership, today also I want to take, and that's what I've done because I'm a long-term, mostly world historian who also did a lot of work on Armenian cultural heritage and such things. When we are thinking of leadership, we think in terms of who is generally in charge in power. And in the 70s, we had an anthropological discussion on the history of power from the early prehistory, from tens of thousands of years before present, all the way to the present. And interestingly enough, the more or less consensus opinion that scholars came to was that we can identify 3 stages of the power in the world on a global scale. The first stage is the power of brutal force. Brutal force, who is strong, who kills, who threatens, who terrifies, and that was the power that existed from the ancient ancestry, pre-human ancestry, from the humanoids, and hopefully culminated in the 20th century in the 2 First and Second World Wars. And the second stage, essentially what came after that was actually the power of money, the power of financial markets dominating the world. The first very small seeds of those that we see starts in Babylonia about 1800 BC. Then they develop in ancient Greece, in Rome, and obviously in modern times. And the power of money gradually rises in the course of the 19th century, but still under condition of the domination of governments that use brutal force. And what we are getting now, toward the end of the 20th century, is the total domination of the power of money. But later, in the third stage, we see the rise of the third power, the power of knowledge. And in our new millennium, because as I said, as a long-term historian, I prefer to think my shortest thinking is, let's say, a generation. The longest are hundreds of years. And in the third millennium, the power of knowledge will be dominant, because power of knowledge can both can destroy humankind, and it can move humankind to new heights, accelerate human progress, improve human lives. And talking about the power of knowledge with regard to human society, last thing in general that I would like to mention is this enormous breakdown that we have between the pace, the velocity of development of technology, and the changes in human consciousness, in human mentality. The growth of technology accelerates at an enormous pace, whereas human psychology in many respects still stays at the level of Homer, of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is still in the Bronze Age. And this is probably the greatest danger that all humankind faces now, including Armenia. So when I am looking at this Quo Vadis question by Saint Peter, I think of it as both the pathways, the ways that we take, and about the leadership. And today's decline in the political leadership, especially in the West, clearly demonstrates that the best people are going out of politics. The most principled people, the most moral people, the people committed to the general good. And this is very dangerous. And it also has its reasons, because social scientists, especially political scientists, from the point when they broke up with history, because political science until the mid-19th century, it was part of history and part of philosophy. There was no independent political science, essentially. If we think even really the term political science at the beginning of the 20th century, mostly related to the works of Max Weber, and obviously the Germans were the first to talk about those issues. So what we have here, to me, what we are missing here, and I'm talking again on a global scale, is that there are two important aspects. That political scientists, before that philosophers, different theorists, they created multiple political theories. And it is only history that is the touchstone, the litmus test, to understand which political theory worked, which political theory didn't, and to put it in an appropriate context and value those political theories appropriately. But to do that, we also need to liberate ourselves from any biases that, let's say, Western theory is better, Eastern theory, let's say, Chinese is bad, and so on and so forth. So we need to just put aside all these things. And talking about historians, I would like here to quote the father of modern historical writing. Now, as I said, we are even in historical writing already. We are past the modern period, but his words are very much relevant. Leopold von Ranke, whom you see here, the head of the German historian school, then the dominant figure in the American School of Historians, still until the 1950s. And this is what Ranke wrote in his work on the history of the last 4 centuries, which means until the middle of the 19th century, of the popes of Rome. To accomplish anything in history, there are 3 requirements. Number 1, a sound understanding of people. 2, courage. And 3, honesty. The first, the sound understanding of people. simply for insight into things. The second, not to be shocked that one finds there when deeply digs into what's going on in human society. And the third, not to disguise in any particular, even to oneself. So do the simplest moral qualities govern even in science. So as I said, history is the litmus test for political theories. Political science is worthless without history, and history is devalued if it's not connected to political science. One could be shocked indeed by how many unexpected truths she or he can learn from rejections of affirmations of different political theories by history, or by confirmation of those political theories by history. So this, my attempt, goes very well in line with this development of interdisciplinary thinking right now, when, let's say, financial markets or business are interpreted in terms, let's say, of Newtonian mechanics or human psychology and so on. And we need to create bridges between these different areas of knowledge to understand what is going on in reality. And in my deepest conclusion, not as much belief, it's like the result of different philosophical theories related to human knowledge, is that still I am an empiricist and very much try to build my hypothesis based on empiric facts and then go back and test them in the data to see whether they can be lifted to the rank of theories. Because theories are as very much accepted in today's philosophy of knowledge, and it's not something new, but theory is a truth, but with the difference that it is a temporary truth until one or another theory are either rejected or absorbed into a larger theory, like, well, say we are thinking in terms again of Newtonian physics that is very much absorbed in Einsteinian physics, or they are just forgotten because they led to nowhere. And so what Aristotle and his students have done, and this we essentially pick from Aristotle's different works, from the references that he is making. He analyzed 158 actual historical cases of government and governance, 158. And he had a wonderful material because ancient Greece was divided in a large number of small city-states, small by our standards. Obviously, Athens was an enormous city-state by ancient measurements. And so there was this enormous diversity. And when we are talking about Greece and the Greek world, it's not Greece as we understand today. We need to remember that the heartland, the birth of the Greek Hellenic civilization was not in Greece. It was on the western coast of Asia Minor, which is today's Turkey. Homer was from Smyrna, Izmir, today's Izmir. The Greek philosophers, Thales, the founder of philosophy, also from the coastal cities of Asia Minor. The father of history, Herodotus, was from the city of Halicarnassus, which is today's Bodrum. And we should not forget that another part, which was called Graecia Magna, or the Great Greece, was also not in Greece. It was southern Italy. not to talk about all these multiple Greek colonies and communities that surrounded the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So Aristotle had this absolutely wonderful material to do so. And he essentially, so I'm not inventing anything new when I'm saying that we need to test political science by history, because Aristotle was already doing that. Here in the upper low row were the social theories that existed in the times of Aristotle. Social theories presented in Plato's Politeia, the Republic, Plato's Laws, Thales of Chalcedon, and Hippodamus of Miletus, who was a big political scientist of that time. And on the other hand, he compared to that the real situation with politics in all this and many other states that also had people who created and implemented theories. So in the upper row of the lower part are those social theorists and political scientists of ancient Greece. The lower row, those were actual legislators who were creating constitutions, and then how those constitutions interacted and how they practically were. So Spartan constitution of Lycurgus, Cretan constitution, Carthaginian constitution, Athenian constitution of Solon, and others. Based on that, Aristotle applied one single criteria, most important criteria, and this is very much also relates to today's Armenia situation, what I'm talking about. It's essentially why a true political order, governance, and constitution should exist. And it's the true or good constitutions should have existed for the good of all, to benefit all. And the perverted or bad constitutions, those constitutions that are for the good or even a single person or a small section of the public, interested section of the public. And so this is the very interesting series of oppositions where when monarchy degenerates, it becomes a tyranny led by a king tyrant, because there was this big also concept, Platonic concept about the philosopher kings. And we actually had in world history several such cases of philosopher kings where under a single king people were very, very happy and had a good life. To my mind first comes Octavian Augustus Caesar. And then we obviously have the Stoicist philosopher, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and later on. But there was always the problem. Those philosopher kings never had a continuation. There is not a single case when a king who was good, very good to the people, to all, was replaced by an equally good other king. So, when we are judging by different parameters, then the second is aristocratic constitutions, where aristocracy deems as their duty to serve others and the interests of others. When it is becoming perverted, it becomes oligarchy of the wealthy. And finally, the best form of the constitution is philosophically or scientifically created constitutional government, the opposite of which is democracy. Now, at that time, obviously democracy was direct democracy. And there is a reason why we need to talk about direct democracy today, because direct democracy becomes a more and more widespread negative phenomenon across the world. And essentially this was the opposite, or he describes it as the rule of the mob, which would be in more detailed explanation given by Polybius, who wrote this brilliant work on the Roman constitution. He called it ochlocracy. He separates democracy from ochlocracy, the rule of the mob. And at the very end, but what is interesting, here are, you can see, from tyranny, which is the most perverted, to democracy, which is the least corrupt and perverted in all those perverted sequences. And there is this famous saying that is often attributed to Winston Churchill, that democracy is the worst, is the very bad of all political systems that exist, but it is the best that humankind has created so far. But the problem with Churchill is that he didn't know enough the argument of Plato and Aristotle, because he simply was rejected from admission to Oxford because he could not pass the test in Greek language and Greek philosophy, so he went to the military academy, to the Sandhurst Academy. I'm just stating the facts. I have great admiration for Winston Churchill. So, and then let's make a jump to another very important document, foundational for political science, which, by the way, is not now studied in most of American programs in political science. They study it in constitutional law, they study it in US history, but not in political science. And it's the famous Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers, which were essentially mostly written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, that argued why the American Constitution must be the way it was accepted, because the people of the city of New York was against that Constitution. And that was why the Federalist Papers published weekly in New York 83 papers written by these three giants of social thought in order to convince the public of New York. Generally speaking, when we are thinking about the American Constitution, obviously the United States Constitution was the product of the European Enlightenment. They all, the fathers of the American Constitution, the founding fathers, they were extremely highly educated in European history, in European political thought, and even they were signing very often these articles with a Roman name, Publius. So, and this is the most important to me statement that opens the Federalist by Alexander Hamilton in the paper. It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, which means the USA, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. So here we have this direct descent from the Greek political thought. And finally, what is very important, and it's not, I'm going just to talk a few words about the philosophy of history by the all-time head of the dialectical philosophy, Hegel. he is not the only one who wrote about the similar things. We find this also in the works of Montesquieu and Voltaire. The fundamental rejection of the possibility of having some kind of ideal model of a political order that will work everywhere and for all times. And history clearly approves of that, because all the so far attempts of exporting American democracy abroad, they failed and they will fail in the future. So this is what Hegel writes. And here is about another aspect. This is about the aspect of knowledge as foundation of state and foundation of constitutional order. Besides, writes Hegel, it is a dangerous and false prejudice that the people alone, so people are not thrown out, people are not rejected, people alone have reason and insight and know what justice is, for each popular faction may represent itself as the people, which we see today everywhere, including specifically in this country, justifying what Hegel says. And the question, and to what constitutes the state, is one of advanced science and not of popular decision. Here is Hegel's fundamental argument against the universality of democracy that cannot be, in Hegel's view, applied in the same way to different countries, different peoples. The ideal, this I just quote, that's why I put his idea that he speaks about the ideal state. The ideal state is thus the embodiment of rational freedom, rational and freedom, realizing and recognizing itself in an objective form. The constitutions under which world historical people, real people in history, have reached their culmination are all peculiar to them. So, each big people that created a great culture, great power, progress, great civilization, they did not work based on somebody else's constitution. Never. They reached their culmination peculiar, based on constitutions and political order peculiar to them, and therefore do not present a generally applicable political basis. Now, let us get to today's political science that is baffled, exploring what's going on and trying to understand what's going on in the world. And you can look at academia.edu or ResearchGate or JSTOR. You will find a lot of works on this subject published in the last 15, 20 years. And this is the historically unsolvable trilemma of direct democracy. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about direct democracy, because it also refers to Armenia very much. And we need to analyze not about what democracy is in general, although we have another problem. Because the founding fathers already rejected, analyzing at the end of the 18th century, they rejected the idea of the application of direct democracy in the United States. That's why the United States Constitution is not based on direct democracy. And now we see, specifically at state levels, attempts to reintroduce more and more direct democracy 20 years after 200 years after it was rejected in the United States. So the problem that, and I'm going to take, and this is the unsolvable trilemma of direct democracy. No, you know that direct democracy is that questions are brought up to the public and the public votes. And it worked to some extent in classical Greece, because the average size of the citizens in each city was somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 citizens. It can work, let's say, at the level of village communities. But on a much larger scale, that's when this direct democracy starts to demonstrating one after another failure after failure after failure after failure. And this is this trilemma. There is a whole literature on this subject. First, real true direct democracy requires participation, which means decision making by almost all the people affected. Which we see that even on the scale of countries not as large as the United States, but even on the scale of countries like, let's say, Armenia, it almost never happens. It happened in 1988 when Armenians stood up and elected a new president, Levon Petrosyan at that time, and at the center of that was the whole Gharabagh Regime. But those are very unique cases. With all my personal admiration for Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, there was no such kind of direct democracy in these April events of last year, because you did not have almost all people participating in that. The second problem of direct democracy is deliberation, which is defined as what is necessary for success of direct democracy, rational analysis where different hypotheses are built on the basis of holistic evidence, which means you need to bring together all the evidence in an empirical way, analyze it, build a rational hypothesis, and based on that deliberation, make your decision. But excuse me, we are getting here to the same ideas of Aristotle and especially Plato and Hegel, that it's a very beautiful goal, practically never achievable. And it's also the argument that were making the founding fathers when they were essentially creating the Constitutional Assembly and such things. And finally, equality, which also, under conditions of direct democracy, never can be achieved. When all members of the affected groups of people have an equal chance of having their views being heard. Look around, it doesn't happen. And very interestingly, that political elites in many, many countries, in the West, in North America, in South America, in North America specifically at state levels, in the United States, perhaps except for China and a few other countries. Whenever they face a big problem, like the United Kingdom, like Great Britain, that faced this problem of immigration, inflow of those immigrants into the British Isles and multiple other areas of discontent with the European Union. So instead of thinking out how to fix the problems, which was a very serious problem for political science, and economics, and demography, and sociology, and obviously thinking of the British way of thinking, first and foremost of history and psychology. Instead of that, they said, okay, we will put a general referendum. We will take away our responsibility. Let people decide. We'll do whatever people decide. And this is the last nail into the coffin of the coffin of the concept of social contract, which is the foundation of today's Western political science. Because what social contract tells you, that people elect somebody to do good for them, to solve their problems. And they do not expect that that same elite will tell, oh people, you decide, we will just implement your decisions. So, and this return to direct democracy we see in in dozens of countries. Not only in England, but obviously in the last 27 years in Armenia. And so, right now, direct democracy, which worked in ancient Greece, it's only a manipulative attempt of indoctrinated or, as many other cases, corrupt politicians to avoid responsibility. Because if we look from that perspective, again, based on empirical evidence and a number of publications, I'll tell you where direct democracy absolutely doesn't work and where it works. It absolutely doesn't work in the cases of the adoptions of constitutions. Because constitutions are usually written by a bunch of people who essentially write it in their own interests, and then it's put to the vote, to the general vote. And by now we are talking about not one, not two, we are talking about 200 cases worldwide, when not a single constitution adopted by a direct vote, direct democracy, worked in favor of people. That's why the founding fathers of the United States were correct when they did not allow a direct vote on the Constitution of the United States. And so, let's see what's going on in Armenia. Direct democracy brought essentially the Pan-Armenian Hayot Samazgayin Sharjum, Armenian pan-national movement, to power starting from 1988 to 1991. Brought to power. And here, the interesting thing is, I am not differentiating between President Petrosyan or President Kocharian or President Serge Sarkisyan. Why? Because their power grew one out of the predecessor, one out of another, one out of another. So this is the result of specific political system that reproduces the kind of governments that we had in Armenia. And that's why I call it for 27 years, Armenia was dominated by the Gharabagh Regime. Why by the Gharabagh Regime? It has nothing to do with the Gharabagh Regime. I call it the Gharabagh Regime because all the movement to which almost all of us, of my generation and a little bit younger and older generation, we all participated. We all participated to a lesser degree or a bigger degree we participated to the Gharabagh Regime, that Armenians had to be protected in Gharabagh. Armenians of Gharabagh should not have been destroyed. And that was essentially the foundation, the objective foundation, that the whole people, both in Armenia, the Armenians, and in the diaspora, almost, there's nothing, never 100%. They essentially established the foundations for that Gharabagh regime. That was initially established through direct democracy. And then what you see, last year, these young people who phenomenally, we need to understand how under the government of Serge Sarkisian, the young people were able to acquire such an enormous degree of freedom of thought. It's a very interesting thing to understand why it was never suppressed, why it was never prevented, but it is the fact, because those young Armenians who followed Nikol Pashinyan with his very, very courageous, I would say, action, that became possible because of technology, because of Facebook mostly. They got together and at least attempted to put an end to this Gharabagh regime that devolved under this devolution system of Aristotle, Plato, Aristotle, and then especially Polybius, devolved from something very positive into something very, very negative. I won't say absolutely negative, because despite all the problems and vagaries in Armenia, we had in these 27 years the growth of small centers of positive social activity, of positive social actions. And I can give you hundreds of examples. And at the end, because I will finish quite soon, I will say how important are those small centers or points of that positive and constructive activity. So, and the same thing, direct democracy was used already in a very much substantially corrupt way for all three constitutions of the Republic of Armenia, adopted through national referendums of direct democracy in 1995, 2005, and 2015. And this is one of the key reasons why we are not going to have, unless big changes are changed under current law system of laws, a rule of law in Armenia. It is impossible. Why it is impossible? Because the people do not think of the law that it's something important to them inherently. Somebody created those laws for their own benefit, and therefore the people need to do everything to avoid it. That's the dominant mentality. Which, by the way, also this kind of mentality emerges also here in the United States. So, just few photographs for you. Yerevan, 1988, birth of the Armenian pan-national movement, end of the Gharabagh regime. Because this concentration focus on Gharabagh shaped all the relationships for 27 years. And here you see from the back Levon Petrosyan speaking to who just was released from jail in Moscow, and the enormous number of people raising their arms. And here, 27 years later, we see the same direct democracy, and the leader of that change, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, who at the very beginning, you can see how he smiles, he himself didn't believe that it was possible. So what is an unavoidable? It doesn't matter who wants what. But who is good, who is bad, who is honest, who is corrupt, it doesn't matter to history. What matters to history, that if you have such a dramatic change, you have a creation of monocracy. Monocracy is a now very widespread term in studies of political science, when essentially the power emerges from the hands of a single person. But it's not like it doesn't have the negative connotation of autocracy. For example, in the classification of systems of governance, 3 years ago, very interesting, let's say, France and China were put together with all the argument as both as monocratic systems. So regardless whether there is separation of power or let's say the role of parliament and so on, there are these historical moments where monocracy is established under specific historical conditions, which is today in Armenia. And then it can develop, either live very long or short term, and develop in different directions. The biggest problem, let's think that in classical Greek classification, Prime Minister Pashinyan is the awaited philosopher king. That he really does everything what he means, what he wants. He has his strategy, but historically all the monocrats have a very serious problem, is that they have a very little room for error. Even if they make an error, because there is no institutional backup, it all remains on the shoulders of the monocrat. And it's, for example, right now, it is a big test that we will see in the coming months in Armenia. Especially after when like a week ago, the new law was passed on the introduction of flat tax. Very important. Why? Because it's very much Reagan-esque that Mr. Pashinyan has this vision, and I think it's going to be good in the long term. Why? Because essentially it promotes legally created, legally accumulated wealth, as opposed to corrupt wealth accumulated through corruption. That's very important. That now people who earn in Armenia high salaries will pay much less in taxes. I am talking about the legally paid people, and we have this emergent group of Armenian middle class who are working very hard, talented people in a number of areas. Like, for example, our graduate of the American University of Armenia immediately get a job, even before they graduate. and get a pay about at least 2 times higher than the average Armenian pay. So it's a matter of competence, it's a matter of abilities. And essentially they will be eventually in the nearest future the beneficiaries of that flat tax. But here is the problem. You introduce a flat tax big time down, lower, you have to fill the holes in the state budget. So the unavoidable thing will be to raise prices. Prices will be raised. First of all, we know already a whole list of things on which taxes will be increased. You increase at the retail and wholesale level the prices, the natural outcome is the increase in prices. The government does not establish prices, but the government votes for the budget, votes for the taxes. The government raises taxes, prices go up. Especially when prices are raised on the wholesale and retail level. And so myself, I expect that there is going to be a big discontent. Discontent with all this, people who do not understand the future, the direction, and people who simply don't want much to change. Because you have these average salaries in Armenia, average income of about $500 a month per person. And there are families, let's say, that have $1,500 to $2,000 per person income. They feel very comfortable. They don't want anything more. There are obviously a class of great poverty. The situation with the retirees is very, very dire and bad. There is this enormous, that's probably the biggest problem, is that the government of Mr. Pashinyan will have to address, and it will take time. And it is this enormous discrepancy between the wealth of Yerevan and the remainder of the country. Now you have half of the population of the country, or at least 40% living in Yerevan. Yerevan is an opulent city, full of money. You see there not only Rolls Royces and Bentleys, you see also Maybachs, brand new, and such things. And you see prices, let's say, in some shops or restaurants in Yerevan, double that what you will see, let's say, in the poorest second city of Armenia at Gyumri. So this certainly is going to create a problem. Certainly. And the other biggest problem with which I want to finish and this talk, and you will be welcome to ask questions. Empirically, we can say that Armenian political thought is now in the search of new solutions. This is to me very, very important. This is related to this liberated thought, at least among the part of the middle generation and young generation of people who are thinking, Quo vadis, where are we going? And the result is that, let's look, the traditional parties, the Communist Party of Armenia, defunct, the Democratic Party of Armenia, defunct, Ramkavar Azatakan Party, defunct in Armenia, Hanchakyan Party, defunct in Armenia, Հայ Հեղափոխական Դաշնակցություն on a deep decline in Armenia. And instead, you have all this gamut of multiple new parties, dozens and dozens of multiple new parties. If you look at the number of people who filed papers for having a political party, they exceeded 100. 100 political parties that come and go, and starting with Հայոց համազգային շարժում, Հանրապետական, Ժառանգություն, Օրինաց երկիր, Բարգավաճ Հայաստան, Երկիր Ծիրանի, Լուսավոր Հայաստան, Իմ Քայլ, and this all before April 2018. Now we have double, triple of the number of these parties. And so this reflects two things, very important things. First thing is that indeed each Armenian, like many Americans, think of themselves as a capital I, who is at the center of everything else. This is another problem when I am discussing in my courses the difference, let's say, between continental European on the one hand and British American thinking historically on the other. So they put themselves and view it the center of the whole universe. They need to have their own, they have their own ideas, they need to create their own political parties. But the interesting thing is, very positive in all these parties. They don't want to return to the previous way of thinking and approach, indoctrinated approach of the previous political parties, which to me is great. And the second great thing that when I think about Armenia is that we moved into a total new era of relationship inside the nation. When we have external threat, we all unify. When that external threat disappears or diminishes, we are all on our own. And it's this absence I'm speaking for Armenia. The situation in the diaspora is different. But for Armenia, and if we can speak about diaspora right now, because probably we need to speak about diasporas, Armenian in plural, not as a single diaspora. And the situation in Armenia is different. Again, everybody together with the diaspora unify against external threats. And then in Armenia, everybody knows. He needs to make sure her own judgment, move ahead with their own ideas, and I think that it is great. Այդ միասնության բացակայությունը խաղաղ պայմաններում եւ չկա արտաքին վտանգ, դա մի հոյակապ բան է, ես խոսում եմ Հայաստանի մասին. It's so great, this unity is so great, it's fantastic, because any attempt to create unity results in the establishment of centralized oppressive power. So this is exactly when I'm saying that we need to actually not completely forget, we need to have for reference history and what we were thinking about politics and about history in the 20th century. And move into the new century with new ideas, new concepts, new terminology that all need to be developed. And that's why here I'm making also a call to ARPA to move to some extent from predominant support of technological development to put more effort into development of the social sciences and humanities in Armenia, because it can be made a very strong argument that now we need much more the development of social sciences and humanities than other areas, because technology will develop very well on itself. We have these wonderful Armenian startups that already have great reputation, those unicorn Armenian companies. They have their offices in New York, in Hong Kong, they have their offices in Tokyo now. I am talking about Pixart with a T. That a lot of people are using, including in the United States, applications, including in the United States, not even realizing that it's developed, made in Armenia. I am talking about, let's say, the surprising development, mostly through the partnership between Armenia and France, of the pharmaceutical industry in Armenia, and so on and so forth. What is missing the positive outlook for the future. This is an enormous danger. Because if Armenians of Armenia will look for all the time for opportunities, they will go wherever opportunity is. Regardless how good justice is applied equally to people in Armenia, and regardless how improves the financial conditions improve, they will always look globally outside for more opportunities. There is also a good part to that we have the emergence of new kind of Armenians, whom I call mobile Armenians. Armenians who, let's say, permanently live in 2 or 3 countries simultaneously. Having homes in Armenia, having homes, let's say, in Russia, having homes in London. And it's essentially, I'm talking not about those who stole the wealth of the country. I'm talking about those new entrepreneurs, specifically who work for big companies, like the biggest taxpayer. Who knows who is the biggest taxpayer now in Armenia?
Petro.
Philip Morris, the #1 taxpayer of Armenia. Yeah. The #1 taxpayer in Armenia, Philip Morris. So, what I want to say, that following Hegel and many other political theorists, I am now discussing in my most recent works, and we are going to have an international symposium, international conference in political science in November at the American University of Armenia, is exactly discussing the current political developments of in Armenia. And if I follow Hegel, I would talk about how we can, and by that I mean obviously scholars in the areas of political science, history, sociology, demography, psychology, how we can eventually create a political system of governance that would be Armenocracy. Why it needs to be Armenocracy? Because it needs to be accepted by the people as their own. So first of all, the first issue is obviously the localization, where we are in history of the world right now, which is our specificity, what we can borrow, modify from the world political experience and history, what we can develop on our own, and we need to revitalize the social sciences and humanities in Armenia, which are still, yesterday they were dominated by the Soviet nationalistic pseudo-Marxism, today by 2 opposite directions, which is a very archaic nationalism and Western mania. Just let's borrow whatever is in the West and try it and so on without any kind of deep analysis. What not to borrow something from the Chinese political thought, which was extremely well developed. And unfortunately, Chinese leaders do not substantially rely still sufficiently on their own achievements of the Chinese political theories and political thinking. And the other big problem that we have, obviously, to overcome is, here I am talking about the German approach to nation building. I just had a student who graduated, and he will continue his education, already submitted applications, goes very well, either at the Humboldt University in Berlin or the University College London, and his work, he already submitted a major work for publication, to what extent German theory applies to Armenians today's situation. And essentially it's the transformation that we have, especially we Armenians, the so-called Volksgemeinschaft, or the global national scale cultural community. It's the term that was introduced and mostly used by Wundt and then by Max Weber, but the biggest theorist in that was Ferdinand Tönnies at the end of the 19th and first third of the 20th century. And how do we transform that national scale cultural community into Gesellschaft, or the Armenian civil society? It cannot take the pathway that it worked in the West. Absolutely not. Especially because we have these two main issues. The issue of culture that I started talking about. We need this struggle for a new culture. Very creative. This is another topic why I am very much concerned that there is now very little creativity going in the Spurk, in the diaspora. Cultural creativity, national cultural creativity. But we need more of national cultural creativity in Armenia. We need to create an atmosphere of positive thinking. And so, what would be a possible components, structural components that need to be explored? I am not proposing any kind of solution here, because these are only thoughts from my studies, from my observations. But all these matters, they need to be explored based on hard empirical evidence. So, and what I'm giving here are some ideas that are evolving and can have a global importance from this idea of Armenocracy. First of all, what would be the main goal of a state in general, of a statehood, Pedagogy? And if you look at throughout world history, from the origin of humankind, there was the humans as a species, as a biological species, were developed in a situation where there is a constant struggle between individualism and collectivism. So the foundational function of the state why I'm talking about these things? Because, believe me, but right now making changes in Armenia is much easier than in the United States or in Russia or in anywhere else. Because, compare it to football teams. How football players, how beautifully they play with their ball. Give them a ball that will be 100 or 10 times larger. Can those same football players play football? No. This is the beauty of being small. Small but beautiful. So, a very important function of the state. And this again, I am telling you my thinking that it's all the time developing. I don't think that I will reject what I am saying now, a year or 2 years from now, but it will be much more developed. So, the main goal of the state, as I think, is the constant reproduction of balance between individualism and collectivism and sustainable development of the country to the benefit of many. That's number one. It can be achieved, another term that I recently introduced, because I'm gradually going way beyond the ideas of what is democracy, what is autocracy, and so on and so forth. I'm going into a totally new framework, terminology, logic, and way of thinking, way of interpreting. Societal gnosiocracy, what it is. It's a Platonic term. He does not introduce the term gnosiocracy, but because he analyzes the relationship between knowledge and science, which is episteme, and human practice, which is techne. And he writes just a large paragraph that there should be in between gnosis, which means the part of that social science that is transitional and applicable to the social government and social practice, relationship between theory and practice. And so here I just create a term in gnosiocracy based on, because gnosis is practical knowledge, knowledge between theory and practice. This very much I just create a term then for the Federalist Papers instead of describing it at length. Then we need to return to the ideas of overwhelming meritocracy. I translate it in Armenian as vastakavarutun, very exact, precise translation, to understand which we need to again look at the Chinese historical experience, and partial bottom-up redemocratization originating in primary societal units, starting from families, different types of communities, and gradually replacing, but never completely replacing, centrocracy. Centrocracy is also a neutral term for any kind of government, top-down government, from top to bottom, from the center. And with this, I'm going to thank you, and now I'm going to take your questions. Centrocracy will be Kentro Navarutun.